Well, I've worked in the field for a long time, so I've been able to dabble with a lot of populations. I've been a youth worker for a number of years, working with adolescents, but actually younger kids too. So anywhere from, I'd say 6 years old to early 20s were the folks I spent the bulk of my time with. But I've also worked with babies and young people and very old people. But the bulk of my professional experiences with, I'd say, teenagers to 20-something. My first job with youth was actually as a coach, with my first paid job. So I was hired to be a football coach at a high school in Oregon for a varsity football team, so it was mostly upperclassmen. And then from that I coached, after that I coached track and field, the throwing events. And so those experiences actually were really fun for me. It was probably the most fun job I've ever had. But from that, it sort of turned me on to the notion of working with kids. And then after I did that for a few years, and I left Oregon and went to Wisconsin and started working in various youth centers and with in the inner city, central city of Milwaukee, with what at that time was called and labeled at-risk youth, although people kind of got beyond labeling and classification. But I worked as a teacher, so in a series of inner city elementary schools. I was a gym teacher for kindergartners through 8th graders. Worked with juvenile sex offenders as a sex ed teacher and counselor. I did a lot of gang intervention work and violence prevention work. So I ran a center that predominantly geared for gang-affiliated youth, clearly who fit the moniker of at-risk. So I've been sort of done a lot of different things. Sports related, there were a lot of sports activities, like activity coordinator and that kind of thing, and I worked my way up through the proverbial professional food chain to where I worked myself out away from the populations that I actually liked, and ended up being a director and then an executive director and all of that. It really depends on the individual. I think some folks just have a more difficult time working with youth than others. I think a comfort level with whom you are, like some self-awareness, and it's hard to put a real term on it, but being comfortable in your own skin is a phrase that's often used. Mm-hmm. So a skill of self-awareness is very helpful. Being fun, or at least fun-loving, is certainly helpful.
How would you define fun?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I would define it by the way that I'm referring to it is someone who is able to see humor in various circumstances, someone who's able to play. I mean, it doesn't sound like a very professional term, right? But to let your hair down, to be vulnerable, someone who can just not have to be right, and who can laugh, and even in stressful and difficult situations. I think that sort of builds to this notion of fun. So, of course, I have my idea of what fun is, and it's not what everyone else would think. But in terms of other skills, is that what you asked, skills, right?
Yeah.
I guess I'll think of patience as a skill set that one can actually practice, and dare I say kindness, and it doesn't hurt to be tough, like thick-skinned, and kind of like understand that it's not all about me, and all of that. So you can see there's a lot of skills, and I think someone could be really strong in certain areas that could benefit particular kids or certain contexts, whereas others may have a weakness in that particular context. to be open-minded and go for it. And I would say stretch your boundaries of what you can envision yourself doing. You know, it's kind of risky. I mean, it's funny because most of our students are pretty young, right? I mean, early 20s or so. Not too far from being, in fact, technically considered youth themselves, but not too far from being, from the age of the folks who they might be working with. And yet it can be really scary and intimidating. So advice would be to chill out and understand that it's not about you. It's about them, and you don't have to be the coolest person in the room. You just have to be in the room and understand some of the positives that the kids are bringing to the table. The young people. I do feel like when we begin from a frame of I'm going to be working with at-risk youth, it sets up this negative connotation, and the reality is that I'm at risk too, so are you. So as we think about how to reframe it and contemplate the positives, I think we have the ability to be very profound in terms of the roles that we can play with young people. Well, of course, being a professor at Western gives me the ability to draw on that kind of interest. But I'd say, personally, and this sounds kind of cheesy, but I think every position I've had connects to family culture and diversity, in part because of the context that I've worked in, and also in part because I really do think it's fundamentally important. The end of life part was pretty unattractive. There were a lot of things that were difficult about it. Part of it was, at the time I started to work with dealing with HIV and AIDS, I knew, and in fact the world knew so little about AIDS at the moment, that there was this pervasive level of ignorance and fear associated with it. So in the back of most of our minds was this notion of not being entirely sure if we are putting ourselves at risk, or to what degree we're putting ourselves at risk of contracting HIV. So there was that little bit, but for the personal side of it, but emotionally, it was tough. Mostly youngish people who were, they were diagnosed quite young and were quite ill. Many of them, by the time I started serving as their counselor. And so being with them through the progression of their demise and of their death was emotionally taxing. I've been around death a lot, and even by that time I had been with people when they died, but to do it in this professional capacity was challenging. It was just emotionally draining. All the time in my practice, and for a variety of reasons, and I dealt with them differently each time. There are a few do-overs I wish I could have, but can't. So some examples would be, I've worked a number of years with people in poverty. I've, dipped into my own pocket countless times to provide money or transportation or food or stuff to clients, which was sort of taboo for most of the places where I was working. Aside from this very moment, talking
if you can possibly think of something else.
Again, this is going to sound cliche, but I really am inspired and motivated by the work that the students are doing, and really motivated by the work that I feel the students will do. That includes you both, but your classmates and the students in the program absolutely are make a big difference, and I feel like I play a role in supporting the development and betterment of humanity, as big as that is, by the role I get to play with you all. And I'm convinced that the world's a better place by the work that you are doing for it. And I get to play just a little role, so that feels pretty good.